Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome here if you're new. So today I'm going to be talking about, can we reform the religion of Islam, and all the topics surrounding this, discussion. Now, the reason somebody might want to reform Islam is so that it becomes a more, modern version, or it's more aligned with Western values. It's more accepting of certain communities like the LGBT community. Now, at the end of the day, people can do whatever they want. If somebody wants to interpret the Quran in a much more modern way, then obviously you have the right to do that. You have the freedom in the West to do anything like that. You don't have to follow the traditional or orthodox or Islam that people have been following since Islam actually emerged and since the religion was established. But I'm here today to talk about, is it actually possible to reform Islam in general? Because if you look around the world right now, I'd say most people are following the traditional version of Islam, or the original version of Islam. Or at least they follow scholars and schools of thought which try their best to stick to, how Islam was revealed by the Prophet Muhammad. I guess there are people as well who have seen what's happened to Christianity and other religions, and they just assume that Islam can follow that exact same path. But I'm here today as an ex-Muslim convert to explain why I personally think reform in Islam is a lot harder, is a different issue altogether. And I'm going to give my opinion as to whether I think it can actually happen, or what the future of Islam is going to look like. Before we can even talk about reform in Islam, we need to actually look at the structure of Islam itself. Like, what makes Islam the religion that it is? What has made it stay pretty close to the original source, or the ways and the traditions that are taking place? The main pillar of Islam is the fact that from the very get-go, it constantly reiterates that this is the final religion. The Prophet is the final prophet. This is God's chosen religion. It's all throughout the Quran. It's reiterated in the Hadith. Yeah, in every kind of scholarly interpretation or understanding of Islam, it is known to be a religion that never actually came to change. And that's actually a selling point of Islam for some people, and an attraction, and something that lots of Muslims are proud of, that it hasn't really changed much since it came. Again, I think that's another distinguishing feature between Islam and Christianity, that Christianity never came down as one complete religion. It's a collection of stories about Jesus's life, plus events that took place after his life from prominent figures such as Paul, that was eventually compiled into what we now have as the modern Bible. And that took place 300 years after Jesus died. And Jesus himself, he didn't come down to earth establishing prayer, ritual, routine. He didn't give his followers clothing to wear that would distinguish them from the people around them. Yet his life wasn't recorded to the degree that Muhammad's life was recorded. Jesus wasn't interested in conquering and taking over land. In fact, he was a pacifist. That's the way you would describe him. Jesus's message was spiritual. He came down with a complete different aim and goal. Now, whether you believe in Jesus or Muhammad, or did they exist, I'm not here to discuss that. I'm talking about how they're represented in the Bible and in the Quran. And I'm just using the sources as a way to explain the dynamics of these religions. Whereas Islam came down as a complete way of life, Muhammad was very clear from the get-go what his mission was. His mission was to establish monotheism, rules and regulations, changing the traditions of his forefathers and presenting a new way of life, a new way of thinking, and a new unity between humans, which would be the glue that kept everyone together. And it's not just glue, it's ultra super glue that really, really holds people together. And part of that, why it's so strong, is because, as I said, and I always say, Islam doesn't bend the knee. Islam doesn't feel the need to change to suit its surroundings. That's always been its selling point. This is a religion which is not just about the spiritual. This is also about your day-to-day life. This is a whole new way to live your life, complete with a community, with a legal system, a legal framework, dietary rules. Everything you can think of is covered in Islam. Now, once you understand that fundamental basis of what it is to be a Muslim, that's what Islam provides for people. That's what the religion provides for its followers, is that sense of concrete stability in belief and way of being. And as I said, it's constantly reiterated in the scriptures. And not just that, through the way Muslims act themselves, which leads me to my next point. So, when it comes to reforming our religion, a lot of it is actually down to the people themselves. When children are born into a Muslim family, obviously, like all humans, they're observing behaviors, and all of this is being passed down. It's not something that people are just, just randomly do, but a lot of it has been passed down. For example, when I was a Muslim, I never saw people openly mocking the Prophet or disrespecting the Quran. It just doesn't happen. In the Muslim families, every Muslim circle I was ever in, every Muslim who was openly Muslim I ever met just never insulted the Prophet. They would never do it. They just don't talk about the Quran in a disrespectful way. They don't air their doubts in public, maybe slightly in the kind of modern day. And you have to ask yourself, why is that? Why are Muslims so fervent and so ultra respectful of their prophet and of their religion? Well, these are traits that have been passed down generation to generation, of examples of how you talk about the prophet, how you respect him. And you will see this cross-culturally. You will see this in Indonesia, all the way over to Morocco, in parts of Africa. There is the same aura, there's the same kind of vibe everywhere you go in the Islamic world, which is you do not insult the Quran. You do not question the legitimacy of Prophet Muhammad. Because the minute you do, or you are now taking yourself potentially out of the fold of Islam if you speak in that way, which is obviously, again, through other learned behaviors. So the minute you bring up reform, it kind of calls into question for other Muslims around you. You will get this reaction of, why are you trying to change the religion? And most people who are practicing Muslims are taught not to disrespect the Quran, not to challenge the legitimacy of the Quran, Muhammad's prophethood, so on and so forth. So in order to change a religion, you would need to change that learned behavior that has been passed down and is still being passed down and is still the general consensus amongst the Muslim community or the Ummah. And I think that because, again, the main figureheads in Islam, the main spokespeople, the scholars, the imams, the muftis, most of these people, I'd say the majority, have no intention at all to start reforming Islam. And these are the people that most of the Muslim community actually listen to. Again, I have had conversations mainly online with practicing Muslims. And if you do bring up reform to them, most of the time they will say to you that Muhammad is the best example of all time and that whatever he did is to be emulated and followed. Some people will say, there were things that were done in those days which no longer apply now because society has changed. And I can't lie, there will be people who do say that, like, there are certain aspects of their lifestyle from the 7th century Mecca and Medina, which obviously you can't bring that into the modern world because we're not those people anymore. But reformation for me would take so much more than just saying, oh, there are some aspects of that culture which we can't bring today. I guess another thing about reform is I would ask people who want to reform Islam and who want to see a more modern version, like, what aspect of Islam are you holding on to then? Because if you don't like the things that Muhammad did, or you think he only did them because of that was the time, then you're kind of forced to ignore the fact that he did some terrible things, which even for those days would have been terrible. It's not like he didn't have slaves. It's not like he didn't start wars with people or wipe out a whole Jewish tribe. That's my issue. It's like, fair enough, as I keep saying, you can do what you want, but I still find the character of Muhammad to be troubling. You're still taking your inspiration and you're still taking your religion from a man who did those things. He's still the role model, he's still the figurehead of Islam. And that's what I find quite confusing about updating the religion, personally for me, because you're still using the example of a man who I think whose character was not something I think we should emulate. I guess people then probably would like to see Islam reformed because, you know, they have cultural ties, or it's the religion that their family practice, so they just want to continue that tradition, or they just think Islam and is the correct religion and they just want to keep hold of that belief. Maybe they want to still worship Allah, but just turn it into something which is much more palatable, which goes better with the modern world, and leave behind all the controversial elements in the past. As I said, that's all well and good. But my question still is, are you comfortable with Muhammad being your figurehead? Are you just going to ignore all the terrible things he did? Because he did do terrible things. And the whole point is, it's documented. The same source that tells you that Allah is the correct God is the same source which tells you that you can possess a slave, a sex slave. I don't understand how you can marry those two things together. Like, as I said, most people would probably reply to that and say, well, that was specific to that time. But then I always ask the question again, I'll ask the same question. Do you think the people of that time deserved to be captured and sold into slavery? Because that took place at that time. And I will say, I don't think that was ever right. I think we need to call into question that person's character and analyze and profile the behavior of that person and that figurehead. Because, as I said, we have plenty of examples from the same period of time or the same region who didn't do those things, who was peaceful, who did encourage charity without doing all the awful stuff also. That's one of my questions I have to people who would like to see the religion reformed is, are they comfortable with Muhammad still being their figurehead? And that's, I guess, why I left Islam rather than trying to follow a kind of modern version or, like, you know, interpret it in a different way. I was still troubled by the things that Muhammad did, and I just couldn't continue to follow him. I couldn't accept that he was a prophet from God. The figurehead of the religion does make a difference, I personally think. Now, I have, as I said before, I have seen people who are following a much more tolerant version. They still take Allah as their God, and they still take Muhammad as a final messenger, and they believe in all the other prophets that came, and they do pray using, you know, the examples given in the Hadith, you know, and they follow the Sunnah as much as they can, and then they just leave all the controversial parts behind. As I said, that's people's choice if they want to do that, and I think that's still much better than following a version of Islam which is more violent, more extreme. I think that if that works for people and they're being peaceful, then who am I to tell them to stop? Because what I'm discussing the kind of logistics of how we would en masse reform this entire religion so that it's no longer the most kind of the default Islam, you know, that people practice, the default version of Islam that you see people practicing, and transform it into something which is less literal interpretation. But I personally think that's going to be a massive task, because you would have to, number one, as I said, convince the Ummah, convince the Muslim world that the core principles of Islam being the correct final version of all religions on earth, that Muhammad is the seal of the Prophet. These are things that you would have to convince many people are no longer true. And as I said, like, as an ex-Muslim, I found it easier over time to just leave the religion completely, because I could no longer justify in my head a good enough reason to continue following Muhammad after finding out a lot of the things that he did, and I did not agree with them. And I think that's the case with a lot of people who might not, non-Muslims who might not know much about Islam, but once they learn about Islam, they also fail to understand why they should be forced to respect Muhammad. But look, if people want to reform Islam, as I said before, they're well within their right to try. I just don't think it's going to be easy, and I don't know if it will be possible. Maybe people will become less observant and they will maybe just be Muslim in name at some point in the future, or they might just leave the religion, or people might continue to practice the way they do now, that the majority of the Muslim world practice. I think that might just continue, because I do believe Islam is a very strong belief system which has survived for 1400 years without much change. And I have to say, this, as I said at the beginning, this is why some Muslims are really proud of their faith, because of the fact that it is hard to change, that it is hard to reform it. They see that as a sign from God that this is true, that their religion is so strong and so concrete. Again, you'd have to convince those people as well why they should change God's word and mold it and bend it to suit modern days and to keep up to date with how modern society is, because in their eyes we should always change ourselves to suit God, not the other way around. And that is one of the core principles of Islam, is that you submit to God's will, not the other way around. So yeah, guys, that's me giving my kind of take on Reformation, reforming Islam, updating the message. I'm just giving my perspective based on what I went through, based through how I used to see the faith, how most Muslims I ever met actually practice the faith, what the mainstream scholars, the most respected figures in Islam think about things like reform. I am not here with a crystal ball predicting the future, so I don't know, but I'm just saying what I think is most likely. And yeah, and that's just based on my experience. But that being said, there will always be people who will interpret Islam in a way which works for them. And I think people are within their right to do that. I do. I'm just looking at it through a theological lens and through a kind of practical lens, if reform could ever happen en masse. Yeah, so anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video again. As always, like and subscribe if you like what you saw, if you want to see more videos. Yeah, and as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I wish you all the very best.